Today on The Secret Case, we'll delve into the dark story of Gary Ridgway, better known as the Green River Killer. A man who, over the course of 2 decades, became one of the most prolific serial killers in the history of the United States. In this video, we'll review his childhood, the crimes he committed, how he was captured, and the impact of his heinous acts on society. Ridgway confessed to having taken the lives of dozens of women, and his story is a warning of how evil can hide behind the facade of a seemingly normal life. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to El Caso Secreto for more content on historical crimes and dark figures. Press the bell to not miss any of our videos. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He grew up in a working-class family, with his parents and 2 siblings. Gary's childhood was marked by a toxic and emotionally difficult home environment. His mother was said to be a domineering and, in many cases, humiliating figure. She often criticized and controlled him in ways that deeply affected his emotional development. On the other hand, his father worked as a bus driver and, according to later testimonies, also had problematic attitudes. From an early age, Gary showed worrying signs of antisocial behavior. At the age of 16, he is known to have injured a schoolmate with a knife, although the victim managed to survive. Despite this alarming behavior, Ridgway finished high school and, shortly after, joined the United States Navy. During his time in the Navy, Ridgway began frequenting sex workers, something he would continue to do even after returning to civilian life. He married for the first time shortly after returning from the service, but his marriage did not last. The emotional problems and instability he carried with him from his childhood began to manifest more clearly in his adult life. Despite the warning signs, Ridgway continued to build a facade of normality that hid a dark side few imagined. The 1980s in Washington state saw the beginning of a series of crimes that would shock the country. In 1982, bodies of young women began to appear in the Green River area outside of Seattle. Most of these women were sex workers or young women living in vulnerable conditions. Police began to investigate what appeared to be the work of a serial killer, although at the time, they had no idea how large the scale of the crimes was. Ridgway would select his victims in areas frequented by at-risk women, taking them to isolated locations before attacking them. One of the tactics he used was to gain the trust of his victims by pretending to be a friendly and trustworthy person. He would often offer them money or transportation, and once he had them in his possession, he would subdue them. The Green River became a key location where he would dump the bodies of many of his victims, leading to the media dubbing him the Green River Killer. Over the years, Ridgway refined his methods. At first, he would leave his victims in areas near the river, but over time, he began scattering the bodies across different areas to prevent police from discovering a clear pattern. This meticulous behavior allowed him to continue his crimes for years without being caught. Between 1982 and 1998, Ridgway committed at least 48 crimes, although it is suspected that the actual number of victims could be much higher. His ability to hide his actions for so long made it extremely difficult for authorities to connect him to the crimes. In addition, Ridgway led a relatively quiet life, working as a truck painter, which kept him off the radar of police investigations. As the number of victims increased, so did the pressure on the police to solve the case. Fear spread through the community, especially among women who lived in vulnerable areas or worked on the streets. Police, frustrated by the lack of solid leads, resorted to different methods to try to catch the killer, including the use of psychological profiling and new forensic techniques. One of the most interesting twists in this investigation was the involvement of notorious criminal Ted Bundy. While in prison, Bundy offered his help to authorities, suggesting possible ways the Green River Killer might have been operating. Although Bundy's contributions did not prove decisive, they reflect the level of desperation that police had reached in their search for answers. The lack of advanced technology in the early years of the investigation greatly limited police efforts to catch Ridgway. However, in the 1990s, with the advent of new DNA analysis techniques, investigators began to sift through old evidence more effectively. This technology played a crucial role in solving the case years later, when DNA evidence eventually connected Ridgway to several crime scenes. In 1987, Gary Ridgway was briefly considered a suspect, but conclusive evidence was lacking at the time. However, police persistence and advances in forensic testing eventually led to his arrest. It wasn't until 2001, nearly 20 years after the murders began, that DNA testing definitively linked him to several of the victims. Ridgway's arrest in 2001 was a milestone in the investigation of the Green River case. DNA analysis was the smoking gun that connected Ridgway to at least 4 of the victims, leading to his arrest. After decades of uncertainty and fear, the Green River killer had finally been identified. Ridgway initially denied any involvement in the crimes, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Ridgway decided to cooperate with authorities in exchange for his life being spared. During his confessions, he admitted to murdering over 70 women, although only 48 of those deaths were confirmed by authorities. One of the most disturbing aspects of his confession was the calm manner in which he recounted his crimes. Ridgway described his actions coldly, showing no signs of remorse or emotion. This behavior perplexed investigators, who saw in him a man completely devoid of empathy towards his victims. Ridgway's victims, mostly young women, many of them sex workers or women in vulnerable situations, were selected by him precisely for that reason. He believed that no one would miss them. Ridgway's cooperation with authorities not only helped close many unsolved cases, but also allowed the victims' families to gain some peace, though they will never be able to recover what they lost. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders, although, as mentioned above, the actual number of victims is likely higher. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This deal, which allowed him to avoid the death penalty, was highly controversial. For some of the victims' families, the idea of Ridgway spending the rest of his life in prison was insufficient for the pain he caused. Others, however, saw his cooperation as an opportunity to close the darkest chapter of their lives. During the trial, Ridgway once again showed his indifference to the suffering he had caused. Throughout the hearings, he stood impassively as the victims' families read emotional statements about the impact his crimes had had on their lives. This lack of reaction painted him as a man completely devoid of compassion. The story of Gary Ridgway is one of the most disturbing in American criminal history. The Green River Killer represents not only a cruel individual, but also a reminder of how a facade of normality can hide one of history's most prolific criminals. His ability to remain undetected for so long and the magnitude of his crimes have left an indelible mark on the history of crime in the United States. This case raises profound questions about the nature of evil and how someone can commit such heinous acts for so long without being discovered. If you are interested in more stories like this, subscribe to The Secret Case and join us for our next video where we will unravel more dark cases that left their mark on history. What do you think about the Gary Ridgway case? Do you think justice was sufficient in this case? Leave us your opinion in the comments.